Since the dawn of man, humanity has been stumped by one single question. If Dune is so good, then why isn't there a Dune 2? For centuries, years even, the most intelligent philosophers and scholars argued amongst themselves, trying to find the right response to this question. But then, in 1984, one man finally resolved this millennia-old inquiry, and this prophetic answer, this key to humanity's biggest mysteries, was unlocked with a little film directed by a chain smoker, called Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind from Hayao Miyazaki. Now, while Miyazaki has never explicitly listed Dune as one of his influences for the making of this post-apocalyptic sci-fi fantasy film and manga series, there are a surprising number of parallels between the two narratives. So much so that several online commentators have labeled Nausicaä as, quote, anime's answer to Dune, and they're certainly not wrong. Both Nausicaä and Dune follow two would-be messiahs that fulfill some super specific prophecy about them being saviors. They're both warrior members of royalty, both of their fathers get killed by the villains of their respective stories, and they feature massive bug creatures that pretty much dominate the world that they inhabit. However, despite all these similarities, I don't think calling Nausicaä, quote, anime's answer to Dune is quite the correct label. In fact, if you ask me, I think a more fitting description would be to call Nausicaä the Anti-Dune. And what I mean by that is that while Nausicaä and Dune might have a lot of similarities in terms of structure and certain story elements, these are more surface-level observations than anything. When you go beyond the similarities at face value and look deeper into how these parallels are utilized, Nausicaä and Dune couldn't be any more different. To me, what makes the comparison of these two stories so fascinating is that it seems like both Frank Herbert and Hayao Miyazaki took the same basic premise and went in completely opposite directions, because the end result are two stories that have very different viewpoints on several topics and themes like environmentalism, humanity versus nature, power, etc. And while each one of these topics could make their own video essay, today I want to focus on one specific divergence between Herbert and Miyazaki: warfare. Now, if you're at all familiar with Miyazaki and his work, you might know that the man is a staunch pacifist, so much so that his pacifist beliefs have become a central theme in pretty much all of his films. But what I find particularly fascinating about the theme of pacifism in Nausicaä is how it's utilized within the context of what's basically a pulpy sci-fi fantasy action-adventure story. You see, in something like an Edgar Rice Burroughs novel, or Flash Gordon, or even Star Wars, violence is an integral part of all these stories. The characters essentially being the most badass, big-dicked giga-chads are just inherent to these kinds of stories' DNA. Big explosions and gunfights and swords clashing against each other. They are essential aspects of these big sci-fi epics and are what usually helps the protagonist overcome their obstacles and beat the villain. And while a lot of this stuff is in Nausicaä, unlike all the other stories I mentioned before, there is never a point in the film where Miyazaki glorifies the violence or treats it like campy, goofy, entertaining romp. There's a reason why a lot of the action is not accompanied by any, quote, epic music, why instead of presenting any long gestating battle sequences or epic duels like in Star Wars, a lot of the action is portrayed in a very bleak and brutal perspective, at least as bleak and brutal as it can get in a PG-rated film. It's because the character Nausicaä, and through an extension Miyazaki himself, looks down on this kind of violence, that it's not something that's fun or should be applauded. It hurts tons of innocent lives, whether it be humanity or nature, and at the end of the day, it's nothing but senseless and brutal. From the very first 10 minutes of the movie, Nausicaä proves that conflicts can be resolved without having to resort to violence, as seen in this moment where Nausicaä saves Lord Yupa from a stampeding Ohm, not by shooting it down or doing some cool-ass epic shit, but by calming it down and communicating to it that they mean no harm. For Nausicaä, the life of an Ohm is just as valuable as the life of a human being, and if you ask me, seeing such pacifism bursting from a protagonist in a story like this is kind of surprising, and it's what makes Paul as a protagonist different from Nausicaä, because one of the first things that we see him do is learn not just how to fight, but strictly instructed by Gertie to always be ready to fight, to kill if he must. Now, while obviously violence is not the most defining aspect of Paul's character, it is an integral part of his character arc because he relies on violence to accomplish what he needs to do. Violence is what earns him the respect and loyalty of the Fremen, which then is what ultimately helps him defeat both the Harkonnen and the Emperor and becoming the new Emperor himself. And this is a sharp contrast from how Nausicaä accomplishes her goals, because while the Pajit and the Tolmekians may rely on violence, whether it be baiting a pack of stampeding Ohm, or breeding an embryo of the giant warrior that's capable of shooting fucking lasers out of its mouth, Nausicaä refuses to fight fire with fire. She opens her arms at the face of gunshots. She stops the stampeding Ohm by returning the baby Ohm to the group, which, by the way, is the only reason why they were even blinded by rage in the first place. And ultimately, she defeats both groups not through violence, but with love, by convincing them that they don't need to resort to such senseless killings. And I think an important aspect that most definitely shapes both of these characters and their beliefs on warfare is the role the villains play in each individual story. And I'm using the word villain in quotation marks because in Nausicaä there really isn't a villain. While groups like the Tolmekians and the Pejit may at first look like evil conquerors who just want to rule or whatever, the film showcases that at the end of the day, these are groups that are consumed by fear and will do bad things to do what's best for their people. Princess Kushana, the leader of the Tolmekians, takes over the Valley of the Wind and grows the embryo of the giant warrior because she wants to restore humanity to its former glory. They want to make everyone's lives better at the end of the day, and to do that, they believe they must use the giant warrior to burn the Sea of Decay and lay waste to the Ohm, scapegoating it as the reason why humanity has fallen. Similarly, the Pejit also resort to violence because from their point of view, the Tolmekians are evil conquerors. They kidnapped and indirectly killed their princess, so in an act of revenge, they use the Ohm to kill as many as possible, even at the cost of sacrificing their own city. These groups at the end of the day are scared and believe that they need to fight fire with fire to teach the other guy a lesson, but at the end of the day, as Nausicaä basically says in the film, after the dust settles and all the people are killed, who really wins at the end of the day? Compare that to the villains in Dune, who are just through and through dicks. Vladimir Harkonnen in many ways can be interpreted as just a pure embodiment of evil, with his nephews being an extension of his cruelty, brutality, and dark charisma. One of my favorite quotes describing the guy is, quote, "What makes the Baron truly monstrous is the fact that he spends all of his time plotting murder, sowing discord, and destroying populations of people to get his way." So naturally, it kind of makes sense as to why Paul has to become so cavalier with violence, because unlike the Pejit and the Tolmekians, who are more morally gray and can be redeemed when shown the light, the Harkonnen can't be reasoned with, nor can they be redeemed. They're just evil, greedy, sadistic, and, well, are just dicks. They thrive and relish over the suffering of House Atreides, so naturally it makes sense as to why Paul wants to get revenge for the death of his father, his friends, and his house, because there is no other option, especially when the fucking Emperor of Space of all people is involved in fucking you over. Overall, I think it's fascinating how sharp of a contrast the paths that Nausicaä and Paul take, despite both being warrior members of royalty, with curious minds fascinated with each of their respective worlds who are forced to become would-be messiahs after witnessing the death of their fathers. Their journeys and character arcs couldn't be any more different, and not to say that one is more interesting or better than the other, but still nonetheless fascinating how two unique creative voices can take such different directions despite having a similar premise. This is ultimately what separates Nausicaä and Paul. While both may become the saviors of their respective people by fulfilling some age-old prophecies, Paul becomes the messiah through violence and warfare, while Nausicaä becomes the messiah through pacifism and love. I originally had a lot more to say in this video, especially in terms of the environmental aspects of both stories, but I think I'll be saving this particular thesis for my future Princess Mononoke video, as not only is this theme more relevant in that film, but ultimately, as much as I like and admire Nausicaä, I think Princess Mononoke is the better version of Nausicaä in every shape and form, but that's a video for another time. For now, thanks for listening to me pull shit out of my ass for 9 minutes. I don't know how long this video is. Once again, I'm Timmy from Tim Jong-un Productions, signing off.